I'm going to talk today about the Lunar Society and the new Industrial Revolution. And I suspect from the work that you all have been doing, both in your graduate work and professional work and the last couple of days of sessions, you recognize that industry as we know it needs to change. Industry as we know it is changing, and not least because of the major drivers of both climate change and changes in the way that we are working. But it's hard to do research on the future. And before I talk about the future, I want to talk about a time that was much earlier when a lot of the world that we're living in began. And a lot of my time will be taken up with what can we learn in this seminal moment when I do believe we're at the cusp of a new industrial revolution from the original industrial revolution back in 18th century in Britain. Now, this is just a typical image I took from the Victoria and Albert Museum of, in this case, an English gentleman from the 18th century, the late 18th century, actually. And it will be familiar to you if you've ever studied colonial history in the United States, although an American gentleman from this period would be a little bit downscale from this fancy London sir. And probably this image looks to you somewhat antiquated and old-fashioned and a time of dressing from a period long past. And those things are indeed true in their own way. But I also want to think about this image from the point of view of manufacturing. This man is wearing cotton stockings that were made on a water-powered stocking frame. Probably the most important piece of industrial machinery next to the steam engine in the 18th century. The water-powered stocking frame was the piece of machinery that the Luddites grew up to smash and break. In fact, it was punishable by death in Britain until about 1815 to destroy a stocking frame. I also want us, actually more so even, to look at the metal. The belt buckle, sorry, not the belt buckles, the buckles on the shoes, the metal buttons, and the buckle on the hat. These buckles were likely made by a man named Matthew Boulton. Matthew Boulton, and they were likely made in his factory in Soho, which he called his Soho Manufactory, and began in 1761. Boulton was unquestionably Britain's greatest manufacturer in the 18th century. And he was an incredible character with a great flair for business and creativity, as well as technical focus and insight. He did a lot of his own experimenting and inventing. He was actually a toy maker, but in the terminology of the time, toy meant not necessarily children's playthings, but any small little metal device, which drew, of course, on an ancient trades of metalworking. His Soho Manufactory in Britain refined the division of labor to transform these old metal trades into major mass market operations and became the largest factory in the world. Adam Smith's famous example, if you've ever read his Wealth of Nations, of the division of labor in a pin factory, likely drew more on Boulton's factory than on any actual pin factory. There weren't very many pin factories in Britain at the time. There were only a couple in France, and Smith had never been to any of them. Now, Boulton drew together a small circle of friends, which became called the Lunar Society, because they gathered on nights, as I think last night was, of the full moon, so they could get home under the light of the full moon, to share ideas from the Enlightenment and absorb the latest scientific experiments and apply them to industry. And this group did nothing less than to ignite the Industrial Revolution, based on the idea that manufacturing, that is making things, And not mercantilism, that is, extracting resources from the colonies, was the way of the future. Bolton founded the Lunar Society with his friend Erasmus Darwin, a physician and the grandfather of Charles Darwin. And they brought together this group of friends and innovators, many of them radical nonconformists in the religious terminology of the day, that is, their positioning vis-a-vis the Anglican Church, to form the Lunar Society. And I must say I've become a little bit fascinated with the Lunar Society lately, and I love the phrase because I think it characterizes some of the good things we could be doing with our society today. The Webb telescope was recently mentioned. It has a kind of forward, outward-looking point of view. I've written a book about the Apollo moon landings, and I teach a course on the moon landings at MIT. So lunar and the significance of the moon is very much on my professional mind. Then, as now, disease, economic stagnation, and political instability seem to threaten a rather dark future. But together, these friends explored the sciences and the ideas of the Enlightenment, and through people like Bolton, brought them to the industrial arts. The group was all male, but socially, philosophically, and industrially, they were quite forward-looking, strongly anti-slavery and mostly favoring the American experiment, although Bolton himself opposed the American rebellion, partly because he was afraid of competition from a renewed American industry. One member of the group was the painter Joseph Wright, and this is one of his famous paintings called The Philosopher and the Orrery. An orrery, of course, is one of the earliest forms of computer simulation. It's a mechanical model of the solar system. And this is an amazing painting because you can see the excitement and the literal light of knowledge emanating from this mechanical model in the place the sun might be. And actually, it's generally thought that this figure here is supposed to represent Erasmus Darwin, the co-founder of the Lunar Society. And you may be familiar with this image. It's sort of the classical image of the Enlightenment, and Wright is considered the kind of great painter of the Enlightenment. Another image you may be less familiar with, but also Joseph Wright, is this one called an iron forge, which actually gives a similar level of heroism and romance to this iron worker's cottage. I think we might rename this image Working from Home in 1772. Just make sure that the little kids don't get anywhere near the water hammer or the forge. And this would not necessarily be Industrial Revolution technology per se. It's a water-powered hammer, but it is elevating the iron worker and the blacksmith to a kind of heroic level, which would be a very uncommon subject for what was considered a low and uninteresting profession and social class at the time. The Lunar Society never had any formal standing or membership list, another thing I like about it. Its contributions were solely based on the relationships and ideas that enriched the members' work. Over several decades, in the late 18th century, though, Lunar Society members included the following: the pioneering geologist Joseph Hutton, who was the first to observe that contemporary rocks might actually reveal the history of the Earth; Josiah Wedgwood, who drew on those latest discoveries in geology for his industrial pottery. I'll say more about him later. The group included the ironmaster John Wilkinson, an early pioneer of boring machines and probably the builder of the first machine tools and iron bridges. You can still go see his iron bridge today in the north of England. And the great canal engineer James Brindley. Wedgwood, too, by the way, pioneered in canal building, because if you're in the pottery business, bad roads are bad for business. And he invested heavily in canals to ship his pottery. And the relationship between manufacturing and canals also underscores the fact that then, as today, manufacturing and mobility and logistics were intertwined, and it's almost impossible to think about one without its connections to the other. Other Lunar Society members included Joseph Priestley, the discoverer of oxygen and the inventor of this drink I'm enjoying up here, the carbonated water. Thank you, Joseph Priestley. Later commercialized by Mr. Schweppes. And also Benjamin Franklin. Franklin was one of the greatest scientific celebrities of his day already because of his fundamental work in electricity. In fact, some historians argue that Franklin's lightning rod is one of the earliest examples of basic scientific curiosity-driven research leading to practical technological invention. Franklin was one of Bolton's heroes, in fact, and Bolton invited him to Birmingham, and he visited in 1758. They did electrical experiments together, and Franklin toured Bolton's factory and admitted to what Bolton called the electrical brotherhood. And electrical experimentation during this period is super interesting because it was totally impractical, had no practical value for another 60, 70 years, but was very much on people's mind and amazing innovations and insights being generated. So the Lunar Society members' curiosities reinforced each other. This was around the time that the discovery and excavation of the buried cities at Pompeii and Herculaneum in Italy sparked a craze for classical themes that Wedgwood exploited in his pottery. I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. Digging canals unearthed volumes of interesting fossils. And Wedgwood and others studied the fossils that were dug up during their canal building. And of course, studying geology helped industry turn those fossils into fuels. Now, in the early 1760s, Bolton met a young instrument maker. He was actually introduced by a man named Small, who I'll talk about in a minute. And this young instrument maker had recently applied his skills from mathematical instruments to engines for pumping out mines. And he had spent a decade struggling with this problem. He was having trouble making the machines work, running out of capital. His financial backer was going bankrupt. And Bolton recognized a young talent when he saw it. And rather than giving him a Hertz Fellowship, he brought him into the Lunar Society. And equally important, he recognized that this new fangled invention could be used for a great deal more than pumping out mines. It could run Bolton's factories. The young man was, of course, James Watt, and Bolton and Watt became the first manufacturer of stationary steam engines, which transformed manufacturing in Britain and around the world. And actually, this is an image of one of their first commercial products. You can actually see this engine in the front hall of the London Science Museum today. And it has the sun and planet gear, Watt's parallel movement, and his separate condenser. The only thing it no, it doesn't even lack it, actually. It's got the flyball governor, which is the key thing to make it useful for industry. So listen to what Bolton wrote at the time. My idea was to settle a manufactory near to my own, by the sides of the canal, where I would erect all the conveniences necessary for the completion of engines, and from which manufactory we would serve all the world with engines of all sizes. We could engage and instruct some excellent workmen with more excellent tools than would be worth any man's while to procure a single engine, could execute the invention 20% cheaper than otherwise, and with as great a difference of accuracy as there is between the blacksmith and the mathematical instrument maker. And I love that final phrase because it really captures a not very well recognized aspect of what they were doing. They were bringing the skills that Watt himself had of the mathematical instrument maker to the factory floor. Actually, very similar to what it took to get the semiconductor industry up and running, where you had to make factories that were basically of laboratory quality, cleanliness, and control and precision, which in the 1940s was a big deal and a radical innovation. Let me read that again. With as great a difference of accuracy as there is between the blacksmith and the mathematical instrument maker. The historian Jenny Uglow, who wrote a great book about the Lunar Society, wrote this: "There's something about this moment, the start of the engine partnership in 1775, that throws lunar science into a new phase. In pace of the slow, careful improvements, the new inventions, the gradual process of mechanization, came a vision not of evolution, but of revolution. James Boswell, the famous biographer of Samuel Johnson, visited Bolton the following year, and he wrote to Samuel Johnson noting the vastness and contrivance of some of the machinery. I shall never forget Mr. Bolton's expression to me, and what Bolton said to Boswell was, I sell here what all the world desires to have, power. Famous quote. Of course, today, our standard measure of power is named after a Lunar Society member, the Watt. Although that name actually comes 100 years later, I should point out. But Watt did invent the unit of horsepower. I flew down here today on a plane with a 300 horsepower engine. We still use that term. Now, another member of the Lunar Society, physician William Small, who was the person who introduced Watt to Bolton and Darwin, had taught at the university, taught in Virginia at the College of William and Mary just prior to this, 1758 to 1764. And then he returned to England with a letter of introduction to Bolton from Ben Franklin. He immediately became the social center of the Lunar Society. He was a remarkably curious, gregarious, outgoing guy, and everybody gave him credit for just bringing people together with his personal magnetism. One of Small's students from William and Mary later wrote this, quote, "It was my great good fortune, and what probably fixed the destinies of my life, that Dr. William Small of Scotland was then the professor of mathematics, a man profound in the most useful branches of science," great phrase, useful branches of science. "From his conversation, I got my first views of the expansion of science and the system of things in which we are placed." Let me read that again. The expansion of science and the system of things in which we are placed. Okay, that student was a young man named Thomas Jefferson, and for Small had taught Jefferson to read Newton's Principia. In fact, Newton's thinking was the source for the phrase laws of nature in the very first sentence of the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson used the words laws of nature, not the words natural law, which was a more familiar phrase to lawyers or philosophers at the time, but he took that idea, laws of nature. The great Harvard historian of science, I.B. Cohen, argues, could only have come from Newton. The second sentence of the Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In that phrase, we hold these truths to be self-evident, Cohen argues, was echoing the axiomatic reasoning of Newton's Principia, which holds self-evident truths not to God or from nature, but from a group of initiated thinkers, only to those who had adopted an entirely new worldview. The Declaration doesn't say these truths are self-evident. It says we hold these truths to be self-evident. So there are links here between the Lunar Society and the founding of the United States of America. Not entirely, not complete, not overlapping, but very real material links. Let's talk for a second about 1776. We just celebrated the anniversary of the Declaration of Independence a couple of weeks ago, but also 1776 saw the publication of Smith's The Wealth of Nations. A little bit of an aside, Gibbon's The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, the first work of modern history, but also the year that Bolton and Watt built their first steam engine in their commercial enterprise. Not to mention, of course, that the very idea of democracy depends on our ability to do the most basic quantitative task, counting votes, something we may actually be forgetting how to do. So together, the Lunar Society embraced and expanded the high ideals of the Enlightenment and were convinced that their philosophical explorations could improve the world through practical applications in manufacturing. And it's worth pausing, of course, that the Lunar Society did not meet in London or Paris. It met in Birmingham. These were provincial people. They were, in some way, unsophisticated, low-grade merchants. They were not the wealthy and powerful of the British Empire at the time who would be in London, who would be in the naval world or maritime shipping or other types of professions or aristocracy. They were provincial intellects and tinkerers who were, again, fairly low on the social prestige ladder. So Josiah Wedgwood was also a member of the Lunar Society, and was equally innovative to Bolton without necessarily as imposing engines. Wedgwood set up his manufactory in 1769, inspired by Bolton's Soho, and Wedgwood called it Etruria. He named it after the, quote, Etruscan vases that were then being imported from Naples by Lord Hamilton. Now, actually, the name is kind of mistaken because we now know that these were not Etruscan vases. They were Greek vases. They were made in Athens, and the Greeks manufactured them at fairly large scale and shipped them and sold them to the Etruscans who put them in their tombs. But at the time, they were considered Etruscans. A little interesting aside here, by the way, Lord Hamilton, who shipped his vase collection and published a catalog of it, really ignited the kind of neoclassical aesthetic craze in the 18th century in England. His wife, a remarkable woman named Emma, who had a career as a dancer replicating many of the Greek myths and even the vases themselves, later, or actually soon thereafter, had an affair with Lord Nelson. She became his mistress, and it was a huge controversy at the time. There's a great film made in 1941 in England called That Hamilton Woman with Vivien Leigh, who had just finished playing Scarlett O'Hara in Gone with the Wind, and Lord Nelson was played by her future husband, Laurence Olivier. It was said to be Winston Churchill's favorite movie. That's the gossip part of the talk there. Wedgwood had a deeper challenge than Bolton because he was competing with high-quality porcelain made in China, known as China, in one of humanity's most ancient crafts, ceramics. But Wedgwood realized he had something that his competitors did not. He had proximity to his market, and he was able to innovate quickly and responsively, both responding to British taste and shaping it. And he remains best known for making this type of classically themed pottery available first to the aristocracy. He was the official potter to the Queen, and also then to the middle class. He collaborated with geologists in the Lunar Society to bring unique British minerals to bear on his pottery. This is the famous blue jasper on the left, which I'm sure you've probably seen, with the mix of these British minerals that he developed and these classical themes. And as I mentioned, he sponsored the creation of canals throughout Britain for the safe transportation of his wares. Interestingly, Wedgwood's granddaughter married Charles Darwin. And a lot of the Wedgwood collection ended up in Charles Darwin, who had no interest in it at all. But Wedgwood, like Bolton, had a vision of the entire factory as a machine. In the words of Lunar Society member James Keir, to convert such trades as were usually carried out by individuals into great manufacturers by the help of machinery, which might enable articles to be made with greater precision and cheaper than those commonly sold. And I'll just point out, if any of you are in London anytime soon, there's a great gallery on the first floor, right when you walk in, called the Enlightenment Gallery that kind of recreates this world in a certain way. And a lot of these early collections and collectors were created at the time. In fact, the British Museum was started with the collection of Sir Hans Sloane, who was a great collector. And you see the interaction between botanical collecting and entomological collecting and archaeological collecting and many of the other Enlightenment sciences in this wonderful gallery, beautifully redone for a modern audience. So the Lunar Society was this incredible wellspring of industrial collaborations and reminds us that Industrial Revolution was no inevitable result of some impersonal march of technology, but rather it was driven by ideas and people, what a lot of historians now call industrial enlightenment. So what were those ideas? Many of them I've mentioned already. The division of labor, the factory system, taking people out of their homes, bringing them into a common area to work. time and work discipline, what we might think of as today's middle-class values of punctuality, sobriety, cleanliness. The disciplined scientific tinkering, later known as engineering. And I think there's a case to be made that Watt really is the first modern engineer. The term engineer was in use for a long time, but it referred to military engineers who were building fortifications, but Watt, with this kind of crossing over between the practical world and the scientific world, and his high mechanical instrumentation skills, in some ways was the prototype of a new kind of engineer. Efficiency, mechanization, later uniformity, networks of conversation and transportation, I mentioned the canals, and Wedgwood's market-driven innovation. A few decades later, the British writer Samuel Smiles actually brought these ideas to popular culture. And actually, I looked this up this morning. The second to fifth most popular genre of nonfiction in the publishing industry today is still called self-help. Samuel Smiles coined the phrase self-help and published a book that was a runaway bestseller in Britain. And it was a guidebook for the poor to rise to the status of gentlemen through, quote, diligent self-culture, self-discipline, and self-control. Chapter 2 of Self-Help is devoted to James Watt and other great inventors. Just a few years later, actually, Smiles followed on that self-help with a series of books actually called Lives of the Engineers, echoing a medieval text called Lives of the Saints. So elevating these kind of ordinary mechanics, which they were seen as, to the status of heroes within this industrial culture. With an entire chapter in Lives of the Engineers, this is actually a modern edition you can go buy today, devoted to Boulton, Watt, and the Lunar Society. Making middle-class heroes out of these great inventors. Let's listen to what Smiles had to say about James Watt. Watt was one of the most industrious of men, and the story of his life proves, and all experience confirms, that it is not the man of the greatest natural vigor and capacity who achieves the highest results, but he who employs his powers with the greatest industry and the most carefully disciplined skill, the skill that comes by labor, application, and experience. Many men in his time knew far more than Watt, but none labored so assiduously as he did to turn all that he did know to useful, practical purposes, unquote. So note the language here. Industry is not an abstraction for far-off factories or technological systems. Industry is a human characteristic. In fact, many historians say that the industrious revolution had to precede the industrial revolution, changes in how people thought and work. And also in Smiles' language, discipline, skill, and application, habits of mind required for building technology, enshrined in the discipline of the modern disciplines and cultures of engineers. Actually, how many of us folks out there are engineers? Just curious. Okay, pretty good, like maybe a third, and hopefully after my talk, the rest of you may be converted. But those of us who are engineers have also been trained and raised in those kinds of habits of mind, as anyone who grows up in an industrial society who's been as successful as the folks in this room have already been. So the Industrial Revolution went hand in hand with the Industrious Revolution. Samuel Smiles helped to enshrine that mythology, one that survives today with the narratives of heroic entrepreneurs, still almost all white men as they were at the time. How should we amend and add to these human traits as we contemplate a new industrial revolution? What are the new habits of mind or changes to habits of mind that we inherit from our industrial world that we need moving forward? With the pandemic, our application to work rhythms more than a century old have suddenly been upended, and we're at a rare moment of opportunity to figure out new ways of working. Another idea of the Lunar Society was actually anti-slavery. Wedgwood created this medallion of an African slave saying, "Am I not a man and a brother?" And And it then became the emblem of the anti-slavery movement in Britain. And he made many, many thousands of them for anti-slavery activists in Britain. And as you may know, slavery in Britain was outlawed long before it was in the United States. Although Wedgwood sent many boxes of this medallion to Benjamin Franklin, and they became equally popular among early American abolitionists. So this early period, when industrial philosophy was formed, bears on our work today in a number of different ways. First of all, manufacturing is the lifeblood of industrial societies. It is a noble enterprise, humbly engaged with the complex material realities of the world. It is a hopeful exercise, creating the things that human beings need for survival and a few of the luxuries that they want. While deeply material, it's also driven by ideas and creates new ideas of its own. Manufacturing has always been tied up with questions of international trade, supply chains, transportation, labor, craft, and expertise, and it's benefited from close relationships between product innovation and process innovation. That is, someone like Wedgwood realized that he needed to make his own pottery in order to understand what his customers wanted and in order to innovate in the products at the same time as he was making new kinds of processes. This is a fact that the entire profession of economics either never learned or conveniently forgot. And it's one of the things that the country is suffering from, because in the mathematical view of many international economists of the last 50 years, we could outsource all of the making while we did all of the fun designing. And certainly folks like Apple have been successful at that, although they have a lot more involvement in the making than you might expect. But one of the things that I'm coming around to is the great need for us to reintegrate our product innovation with our process innovation. Manufacturing is dynamic. It's in constant response to the dynamism of the world, whether it's changing supply chains, changing workers, changing market demands, new technology, changing tastes. The factory that can be set up once and make the same thing forever simply doesn't exist. An anecdote here, I was once meeting with one of the senior folks at Airbus here at MIT who owned, something like 350 factories that make components for the Airbus aircraft. And he said, you know what? We make a very highly standardized product. We have a backlog of, I forget the exact number, but it's like 6,000 airplanes. We're going to be making that same airplane for the next 20 years, basically. And it's more or less the same airplane that we've been making for the last 20 or 30 years. Given all that, my biggest problem as a manager is organizational learning. So many things are changing all the time, whether it's Brexit, this was before the pandemic, but pandemics and wars in different places and supply chains, that we make this totally standardized product and still the manufacturing is completely dynamic. Another analogy is the number of people who touch your iPhone with human hands before it goes out the door is actually about 100 for, again, a very highly standardized, very highly mass-produced product. Most products are not nearly as standard or regulated as an iPhone or an Airbus airliner. So the Wedgwood medallion also shows us that manufacturing originated in this idea of industrial enlightenment, and that our greatest ideas about philosophy and science are expressed in how we make things. And how we make things and market and distribute and use them can be a vehicle for improvement in human life, both by supplying basic needs, but also too by responding to and driving social change. That said, there's plenty that the Industrial Revolution got wrong. Some would say these are inherent faults of capitalism, although historical evidence says they were more the result of conscious choices to avoid difficult realities and lack of imagination. Environmental degradation was part of empires built on cotton planted by enslaved people, child labor, workplace injuries, the oppressions of Taylorism, dehumanized assembly lines, centuries of violent strikes, segregated unions and workplaces, communities ravaged by deindustrialization. These problems, too, trace back to these original Enlightenment thinkers and how their Enlightenment, their industrial Enlightenment, failed to address two problems: environmental degradation. Factory towns were polluted as soon as they were created. Many of Wedgwood's own workers suffered from lead poisoning, for example. And the problem of labor. How do you offer people dignified work lives and a share in the prosperity they generate? The first, in the form of the crises of climate change, has forced itself on industry, and manufacturing is beginning to pivot away from fossil fuels, but with a very, very long way to go. The second was already in flux before the pandemic, and now we're in a world of the transformation of work, unlike anything in our lifetimes, and maybe unlike anything since this early period. As was mentioned earlier, I recently concluded a kind of 4-year stint leading MIT's Task Force on the Future of Work, many of whose members are continuing to work on these problems today. And by no means did we answer all these questions. Our task force was in force before and during the pandemic, and so we had a chance to see how the pandemic exacerbated and accelerated things that were already underway, like straight demographic labor shortages, for example. I would say there's very little you can say about the future, but one thing you can say about the future is how many 20-year-olds are there going to be in 20 years, and there aren't going to be enough. We also said that if all the new technologies we're working on today are deployed in the same labor systems that we have today, we'll end up with very similar results. We need to innovate in the very systems of labor that we work on, as well as the machines that we make. I'll point out that my co-author here, Liz Reynolds, is now leading manufacturing and supply chain for the White House, and really on the front lines of how all these ideas are getting out into crises of everything from baby formula to clogged ports. Very topical set of questions bringing themselves on up. So finally, to come around to where we are today, on the cusp of a new industrial revolution, we all have a sense that it will combine robotics, AI and autonomy, electrification, information technology, and new forms of work into new forms of industry. We know a lot of the pieces from an industrial point of view: flexible specialization, human-robotic collaboration, electric power, some onshoring, IP security, additive manufacturing, flexible work, remote and virtual presence, regional economic development. You can add your own to the list. But we know that this world has to work more clean, more efficiently, and more sustainably than anything that's come before. But we still lack a coherent and inspiring vision for industrial society in the 21st century. What are we actually building toward? How will it all tie together? What are the new habits of mind that we need to, each of us, adopt for ourselves beyond these industrial disciplines, or maybe incorporating them? What are the most promising technological innovations and businesses to propel us forward? And of course, what's possible that we can't yet see? Like the Industrial Revolution that began in 18th century England, the coming revolution will not simply happen. It will be driven by ideas and people, many of them the people in this room. So how can we imagine a future for manufacturing that gets the two problems right, environment and labor? What does industry look like when it strives to optimize for lowest carbon footprint as well as for the greatest profit? When it upholds dignified, inclusive, and sustainable work? Corporate sales visions of Industry 4.0, like these images, are literally what they look like. They are empty. They're greenfield factories, isolated from broader systems, and they totally lack human beings. They're not going to get us there. My Work of the Future colleague, Sue Helper, a labor economist who's also working in the White House, puts it this way: Industry 4.0 has not gelled into a genuine new production paradigm with radical new ideas and increases in productivity. Anything like Wedgwood's factories, the division of labor in Bolton's factory, the later American system of manufacturing, Henry Ford's mass production, or the Toyota production system or lean manufacturing did in the 20th century. These are problems that I am just beginning to work on as a researcher, an entrepreneur, and investor. I've recently formed a new investment company, a kind of industrially oriented venture company, tailored to long-term sustainable industrial transformation. U.S. industrial sectors are responsible for 70% of greenhouse gas emissions in this country. We're not going to address that problem without addressing the industrial sector. And we're looking at core technologies required for tomorrow's industries: additive manufacturing, green power, autonomy, robotics, and again, as I mentioned, new ways of working and revitalized U.S. industry. So what will be our industrial enlightenment for this next generation? How do we imagine futures that are optimistic but realistic, not utopian, but forward-looking still, and built on the world we have today, with all of its gritty problems, but still boldly transforming it? What innovators will embody the ideals we imagine for the next industrial revolution? I'm sure some of them are in this room today. What will be those new habits of mind? How do we modify and update those original and fairly outdated middle-class values? I think what historian Jenny Uglow said about the Lunar Society also applies to the people in this room. This is a quote. "Together they nudge their whole society and culture over the threshold of the modern, tilting it irrevocably away from old patterns of life toward the worlds we know today." So I look forward to watching as the Hertz Fellows begin making this new industrial world that's indelibly sustainable, but also indelibly human. Thank you very much.